I know I left on a little bit of a cliffhanger, but I'd like to rewind about a minute and go into slightly more detail about what happened. You see, as they were resting, the people on watch basically see nothing. It was both Hagaide and, yes, I know it's Hagaide, frickin' Japanese names, and Coulson. They managed to yell out a warning, and that's basically all they get out. The party is woken up by a sound that I described as a sickening crunch, as though a dozen crisp leaves were abruptly snapped in two, and there was a very high-pitched scream that warbled towards its end. As the party got up, they looked up and saw Kesrinthka hovering in the air, still mostly wrapped in her bedroll with a massive black spike jutting out of her midsection, with white blood leaking everywhere. The creature holding her is a nightmare, pitch black, with yellow-slitted eyes that glow a yellow, standing on 2 front legs and 3 rear, each one terminating in vicious-looking claws. The one claw holding out Kesrintha is coming out at something of an odd angle, like it was grown out just for this purpose, as it has no other visible appendages. It speaks in a monotone and tells them, "In recognition for what you have done, you are spared. I will take only the one who touched the crystal." And then it flexes all 5 legs down and says, "If you wish to save your comrade, I will be to the north." And then it thunders off incredibly fast towards the north, and incredibly quiet, almost eerily quiet. There's no sound that its footsteps make whatsoever. If not for the absence of Kesrinthka, and of course the blood still flecking the glass, it's entirely possible he might not have ever been there. The party has a bit of a mixed reaction to this overall. Rory, for example, says they should go and get some sleep before going after him, but most of the party members immediately contradict that idea because they think, given the way she was just injured, it's very unlikely that she's going to survive the night. So they basically tear off. One of the party members, Snarg, literally doesn't say anything. He doesn't even convene with the party. He grabs his stuff and runs, trying to track as best as he can to the north, trying to figure out exactly where and what and all that fun stuff. Now, scroll down a little bit here. The party tries to get some information based on the creature, but the only thing they really come up with, and this is only going to really make sense to you if you've been paying attention to the way I've described my setting, is that it looked like an extremely small miniaturized version of a griever. And the only one who really recognizes that is Tabrin, someone who is from the Dyers, being a lycanthrope, and as such can appreciate what exactly a griever is and the full threat of it. He cautions... Well, he cautions caution. He says we need to be careful about this. We need to be very particular in how we approach the situation. But on top of that, most of the party members, Zeiss included, suspect with good reason that this is in fact a trap. And it's kind of hard to argue with that given the way it baited them and has basically thundered off. When they get there, I've been debating whether or not to go into detail about what happens. But the best thing I'm going to say is that what they find to the north is a mausoleum of sorts, right? And when they enter it, the party enters it as a whole, very careful, looking for traps, cautious, listening. And after a certain point, the party begins to realize that the rest of them are not actually there. There's this pool of water that they can interact with, and in so doing, I believe it was, here we go, Hanuel, Higaid, Snarg, Sethos, Caladrius, and Zeiss are in one party, and Rory, Z, Firnasil, Tabrin, and Coulson are in the other party. Now, when everyone materializes in there, it takes them a moment to realize that they've split up and that they can't see the others, and they're like, okay, fine, we'll deal with this, no problem. Now, as they go, they encounter these blue orbs that look kind of like this swirling blue pearl, where the swirls on the edges are just kind of slowly shifting around it as though it's the atmosphere of a planet, for example. And they examine it, and they do all sorts of stuff with it. This is the group in the well, I'll just go ahead and say it, and the darkness half, where everything is very dark. There's these, they can't even see further than 10 feet in any direction, and it's incredibly shrouded. There's these black, inky, blotted clouds everywhere, etc. And they're the ones who actually see the orb. On the other side, there is still an orb, but before they can get to it, it starts moving basically on its own, and being carried around and so forth and so on. The way I did this took some effort in an online group. This would have been actually much harder to do in a real-life group, though, at least in my opinion, because if you're paying attention, what certain things in one side affected certain things of the other, and vice versa. And so I had to basically GM both groups simultaneously, because what one was doing would affect the other presently, and so they would then react, which would also affect the other, and so forth and so on. It was actually rather challenging, but very fun to do. So I'm going to skip over all these specific puzzles, because it would take a long time to really elaborate on everything, and suffice it to say, after a while, it appears that they're in what is best described as some sort of dreamscape, and the various rooms they go in through are representative of things that someone has gone through in their memories of their life, and they discover a place where there is a young elf and his mother, for example, and she's constantly crying on her knees, desperately wondering where her child has gone. Can't be roused, can't be interacted with at all, actually. Like I said, this is merely a memory. They also find a schoolhouse where they hear constant yells and cries of children who are mocking and otherwise deriding someone, insisting that it's their fault that their mother died, insisting it's their fault that things are the way this are. And when I say cruel, it has been often remarked that children can be cruel, especially in school. But I mean a step past that. I mean genuine cruelty. You know, actual physical, mental, and emotional harm, and so forth and so on, to a significant and indeed extreme extent. That kind of thing. Really fun place. I wanted to look up something specifically. So if you'll have to give me just a moment. That's right. Here's the part. Based on what the people in the light realm were doing, they managed to in the school area, a fairly large amount of creatures were slithering through. These looked like just black shadows, basically. No, not these shadows. They just looked like inky blots that were just kind of moving around all towards the school. And the more they hear about them, the more they hear these things, these whispers, these voices and taunts and jabs, jeering and screaming about you, about your dead parents, and why don't you shut up about it, you big baby. Things like that, right? Lovely things like that. Now, after a point in time, they decide to go ahead on the light side and use the ruined orb, which they still have, by the way, they've been using it this entire time, to try and interact with part of the door. What happens as a result of this is all of the creatures rather suddenly go away, each one of them screaming as they vanish, and there is suddenly a very visible young elven boy who has a small, plain kitchen knife in his hands, and he says the words, "It was the only way after all." After having encountered this, whoops, damn it. One moment, please. God. So many archives. This is probably the only downside of doing this. I mean, it's nice having an archive of every adventure, but my God. Here we go. After having done all this, both the groups managed to reconvene in the main room and see one another. Like, okay, that's... I guess we're here now. And as they look around, they realize that there actually is no door behind them. This will actually be relevant later. And they're not really sure what to make of that. Excuse me. I only got a couple hours of sleep last night. I was up GMing. With all the group assembled, they realized three things very quickly. Number one, the young elven boy I just mentioned is actually standing there in the middle of the room. There is this really strange energy kind of pulsating off of him, emanating towards the far out of the room, and it's creating a force field. Now, if I can describe this properly, if this is the room, obviously it's not just a basic box, but bear with me. The boy is in the middle of it, and the force field is cutting it by this way. And it took me a while to get that point across to the party, because they kept trying to go around the boy to get to the other side of the room. I was like, no, you can't. The force field is being generated on the boy. So they could not bypass. And they see the creature, which they have started dubbing the Nightmare, on the other side of it. Now, because Rinthka is nowhere in sight, but it says something simple. You'll forgive me for failing at voice acting the Nightmare, but you see what horrors your world produces. Let us see what you produce. Kill the child, and the field will drop, and rage can be had against me. Spare the child, and watch me go, and I promise your friend will live. Choose. So, the party, to my somewhat surprise, reacts rather emotionally and violently, and insists that they absolutely refuse to kill the child. Pretty much 100%, I might add. By the way, Hanuel, the fairy, looks at the child and notices that he is of the water affinity, but there's something very odd about him. Well, I'm sorry, I didn't actually say universally, but because Zeiss was actually prepared to kill the child, because as we've discussed before, Zeiss is evil. So Zeiss was ready to go and stab the child to death at a moment's notice. Tabrin, who was a rather inventive sort, I just feel like mentioning this, actually cast Reflect, which is one of the spells in my setting, on the child, but unfortunately it actually fizzles, which is something that is incredibly rare and can only be caused by some kind of external stimuli, so he's not sure what to make of that. Now, the group also tries to analyze the creature itself, but all they can tell is that it is some kind of unusual mess of technology and organism, and again, that it looks a heck of a lot like a small griever. So, then there was an event happen. I'm just gonna kind of breeze over. It was kind of a real life drama mess, which we're just gonna blow right over that. With apologies to Rory, but long story short, the questions ended up asked, and what were the actual 3 questions? It basically told them, they bargained with it, which admittedly I was completely unprepared for as a GM, I'll freely admit that. And so after some thought and after some rolls, I decided that they go ahead and earn the right to 3 questions. So, why steal Kezrin and give us a ridiculous ultimatum and still give her back in one piece was Fearneseal's question. Snarg's question was nothing, apparently. Hang on. Tabrin wanted to know what was going on with the trial. And Rory, I believe, asked, what is it you want? What is it you wish? So the thing responds, and I quote, I only said you could save your comrade. She is required by the Pinnacle, and will not be released, but by my word she will live. In response to the second question, I serve the Pinnacle. And in response to the last one, we seek to return the world to its natural state of discord. And then it leaves. Very quickly, because this thing can move incredibly quickly. Now, immediately after that... Oh, I'm sorry, did I actually... Whoops. That apparently was the thread from before we retconned things because of the whole drama thing I just mentioned. So, apologies. You'll have to give me a moment to try and find. That's right. Okay, so I'm sorry. I do apologize. Rewind a little bit. They asked their questions, which are basically the same as what I just mentioned. No real relevant changes there. What they decide to do is they go ahead and they basically touch the boy, and in so doing, they mentally establish a bit of a connection with him. It requires a few willpower checks just to even manage that. And in so doing, they merge with his psyche, which at the moment is so tortured and fractured that he could barely be considered a living being at this moment. But through the combined efforts of the party, they manage to reunite his fractured shards with themselves, which takes some effort and some work, of course, and quite a few rolls. And none of the party gets damaged as well. I was very surprised by how well they did on this, and manages to piece it back together to the point where the boy is whole, obviously still traumatized, but he is at least alive and still has his soul in one piece. So, props to them for that. That also lowers the field, and of course, the nightmare creature then, of course, leaves. There is one other thing it mentions before it leaves, which I'm going to quote here. We of the Pinnacle do not embrace the chaos of evil. We embrace discord. The world is safer, cleaner, purer, without the artificial chains of a slow death. Greed, decay, disregard, antipathy. That is what organization has brought you. It was not always this way, and we will return it to the way it was. And then it leaves. Sounds like my sister's home, too. So they go ahead and take the boy out, and they exit the room. Now, there's a couple things they find on the way out that are incredibly significant. Number one, they find what is effectively a treasure room. But they don't find gold or jewels or anything like that in there. They find an unusual stone. It's of decent size, and it's pulsating and glowing with vibrant amber and yellow light. The only one of the party members who actually rolls well enough to identify this thing, because it's a very rare and unusual artifact, is Coulson, who identifies it as a piece of lacite. Lacite is very similar to magicite, as I've described before, but effectively much, 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 much more potent, much more condensed, and much more dangerous. The number and amount of things you can do with lacite, as opposed to anything else, basically, are virtually astronomical. So, this is quite a prize, although simply utilizing it or selling it presents its own little dilemma for the party, which admittedly was kind of the point. Now, as they leave the mausoleum with their lacite in tow, which Guido's carrying, by the way, because he's the only one they trust with it, they notice that not only is it daytime now, but they're in a completely different area. And several of the people do some survival rolls, and near as they can tell, well, they don't know exactly where they are. They are in a vast... Whoa. I am tired. In a vastly different location than they were before. Probably based on the general terrain area and the types of it, somewhere within the Alluvian lands now, rather than over on the edge of the Nevere. So, at the very least, they might not have gone far, but they have at least transported somewhere in the process of all that. And they're not 100% sure where exactly they are. Now, as they're getting their bearings and trying to figure out what they're doing and how they're going to do it and whatnot, they notice that they're talking about how unpleasant it is because they lost their wagon and their horse. But to their surprise, their wagon and their horse is in fact there, just over around a hill, actually. Zeiss ends up finding it, and he's very confused by this, so he goes ahead and checks it for traps. He finds no traps. What he does find is a strange 8-sided crystal that glitters violet, and he's pretty certain that it wasn't there before. Now, when Zeiss touches the crystal, he's like, I need to go show this to the group immediately, and so he rushes off and goes to show the group, this crystal. And the group is fully assembled. A projection appears out of it. It is a tall-looking man. Well, I shouldn't actually say that. If you could picture a tall robe with no one within it, very black, deep black bluish robe, more blue than black, but it's very dark tarpon blue. And it's got absolutely no symbols or runes or anything else threaded, whatever. It's a completely plain-looking robe. No hands, no face, and no legs within the robe. Just the robe standing there, hovering before them. However, there is one thing visible within the hood. There is there's a mask, an ivory mask, which I'm going to look up the specific description of. God. And it's going to take forever because OpenOffice sucks. Because I don't have my license of Office anymore. Here we go. He has a oval-shaped ivory mask, kind of going like this, where his face or head should be, right? And it's bisected in the middle by the indent, so it's kind of coming over like this. And there are slits for eyes. There's nothing behind them, just the slit and the mask. And then there's a frown right about here, which is I can't do it because it's not physically possible with my mouth. But it's a very emphasized negative downturn. And there is a faint glow of green within the robes, but there appears to be no source of it that they can tell. A very deep forest green, I might add. Now, as they discuss and talk with this individual, they learn that he is referred to as the Warden. He actually flat refuses to give his name to them. And in fact, when they try to... Tabrin, rather intelligently, tries to summarize his title, which he reacts violently to. And in so doing, Tabrin learns that these people, who or whatever they are, place a great deal of emphasis on names and titles, and therefore did not want them to be diminished. Well done, Tabrin, for getting that insight on them. Zeiss also gets really pissed off because of this thing, because it treats Zeiss with a rather, how do I put this? Derision bordering on disgust. I forget the exact quote, but basically the Warden, as he calls himself, mentions that individuals like Zeiss are the reasons why the world is as bad of a place as it is right now, and why it needs fixing. Zeiss doesn't take that too well. Now, Rory actually pokes his axe at the projection, and it just goes through without any reaction. The Warden basically immediately starts info-dumping them, almost without preamble. Its voice is almost cadenced, with a little bit of a bite, an undertone to it. And it tells them that the Order has sold them out. That the Order has blamed them as the ones who were behind the sabotage efforts in attempt to foster warmongering between the Navari and the show. It mentions it was done for political reasons, but they don't have any other information right now. Now, the party, of course, takes this rather poorly, as one might imagine. Now, the Warden also mentions that it basically doesn't care. He doesn't say this outright, but based on the way it talks with them, it doesn't seem to care all that much about whether or not they clear their name politically, so much as what they end up doing next. When the people ask, why are you here and what's this going on, it says, well, as ordered, I have returned your equipment to you in order to assist your journey, because one of your number has impressed the Master with their methodology, and I am therefore capable of putting my resources at your disposal to assist. And it also mentions that the party seems to have a general lack of direction or leadership, to which the party agrees. They don't actually have a leader, per se. They just have other stuff. So... Wait, what? Oh, right. Zeiss immediately starts saying, what can you give us? And the creature basically refuses to acknowledge that Zeiss exists from this point on. It also is curious as to why a human is on Dareth, and shows a great deal of understanding of what a human is pretty much immediately. A lot of quiet foreshadowing is given out by this creature as it discusses with them. Among other things, it mentions the 3 continents, even though most people are only aware of 2. It also mentions that the Order has been doing actions lately that don't make sense, mainly because all those actions are incredibly illogical. Now, in addition to that, it also mentions that it is willing to offer them a degree of aid for the moment based on its orders, but any further information or resources is going to have to be earned. Furthermore, the party actually asks it a few specific questions. Excuse me. I'm going to have to stop recording after this video. For example, it mentions that the undermarket is in shambles. This is actually the first part this really comes up. It was mentioned in passing earlier, but the fact that the undermarket, which has served as the financial foundation for the entire world for so long, is just in ashes, really comes to the fore here and will become a rather important point in the next few sessions. In addition to that, one of the biggest priorities for Z in the party is she wants the boy they picked up, who they still have, Andre, the desolate child. Oh, by the way, he was a desolate. I don't think I mentioned that. To be taken someplace safe. The warden agrees that they will go ahead and arrange for one of his servants to show up and physically transport the boy somewhere safe. Let's see. Any other specific information that was given away here? There was a lot of stuff given away at this point. This is also the point at which I called it the, where is it? Roads in all directions is what I called this, because that's basically what it was. The party had pretty much full freedom to go wherever they wanted, and several quest hooks they could follow up on if they wanted to, but shrug. Now, the way that the crystal works is it has to be recharged over a period of time, but they don't actually know how long it will take for that to happen. So basically, as soon as the warden is going to go away, his time will be up and he will no longer be able to be contacted by them. Now, at one point in time, one of them asks if their master intends to bring the world into discord, to which the warden replies, and I quote, "My master was one of the whole when this world was saved from discord and chaos, both spun into organization and order." Important little tidbit there. Hanuel insists that, it basically asks in a very accusatory fashion if the warden and his master work for, the group that has been torturing people's minds and feeding their suffering with twisted elemental energy, in which his response is basically, the master has no interest in pain and very little interest within the elements. Snarg asks about his tribe, because that's what he cares about, and he answers a few questions about it, but basically there's no information to be shared about that. There's a lot of Q&A that goes to this, which I'm just kind of breezing over here, because they've asked a lot of questions of the warden. But, long story short, after the warden vanishes, a unusual-looking straw creature appears, more or less out of nowhere. I shouldn't even call it straw creature. It looks like a very, very crude simulacra of what is intended to be a normal humanoid, probably an elf. And it appears with this unusual cadenced voice. Now, its name it gives, I actually decided how it was going to be pronounced at the time, but it's something along the lines of, and it decided that they could go ahead and refer to it as by its designation rather than by its name. So they started referring to it as the Sotiris. Now, the Sotiris offered to go ahead and take several letters for them off, one of which was to the Wildpaw tribe, one of which was intended for Bagan and the Lady Airfall. That was from Fear Nacil. I believe there are a couple other letters there, but the important one was, finally, there was a letter that was going to go to the woman they met earlier, Torella of Fire Tree, the mother of the desolate boy they encountered a few days previously. Desolate girl, sorry. And the idea here was Z wanted Andre, the desolate child they have now, the elf boy, in order to be given to that family in the hopes that they would be able to take care of him along with their desolate child, right? So the Sotiris agrees to go ahead and transport the boy and take the letters off, and vanishes with a crack of wind. Now, at this point, the party has, again, a lot of options as to what to do next, but ultimately they decide they're just going to go ahead and head east because, based on the warden's information, and what the Sotiris confirmed, they're actually quite close to the coast. So they believe that they can at least use that as a guideline in order to make their way north and possibly hit, Holtberg or something else of significance along the way. Now, normally I'd keep going because I intended to go to the part where they actually hit Holtberg, because they do end up heading there. But you'll forgive me for pausing because my throat is giving me more trouble than I thought it would. So I'm going to go ahead and pause this one a little bit early, and hopefully, despite a little bit of meandering, I apologize, I am quite weary. You nevertheless enjoyed this one, so I will see you at the next adventure, the next episode.